This is just completely uninformed, and honestly, I think either just came from somebody telling them alt history nonsense, or it's just a deliberate lie. I want to talk about Tristan Tate. The Tate brothers haven't talked much, like a ton, about Ukraine recently. At the start of the war, they dropped some pretty bad takes. I covered it on my main channel, DylanBurnsTV, at the time. I talked about Andrew Tate specifically and his history of just having a terrible batting average on this war, of just getting basic stuff on the war wrong. But this right here is the most direct statement from either of the Tate brothers on the war that we've gotten in a long time. And man, there was not a single thing in the entirety of the argument that he put forward that was true. Every single thing he lied about. It was a speed lying competition by Tristan Tate. I'm going to read you 2 tweets, and then we're going to break down the second tweet, because the second tweet is where I have the majority of my objections, because that's where he makes the argument for the first tweet. Here is the first tweet that Tristan Tate put forward that somehow has graced the eyeballs of 1.5 million people, and 12.8 thousand of them apparently thought it was a good message. It was a message with some rationale to it. He says, "I feel incredibly bad for all the young men dying in Ukraine, both the Russians and the Ukrainians. This is the saddest chapter of European history since the breakup of Yugoslavia." Okay, if he stopped here, you know, some people might say this is both sidesing it, but it's not really that bad of a message. I might even say it's a good message. But then, Western politicians are responsible for the slaughter of a generation of brave young men. Brave young men. So it's the West's fault, not Russia's fault. It's the West's fault for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For Russia trying to extort Ukraine in 2014, getting pushback on that, and against their backed president, Yanukovych. They then cracked down on protesters, killing them. Protests spiral out of control. Yanukovych flees. They invade. They annex Crimea, hold politicians at gunpoint, after they promised in the Budapest Memorandum they wouldn't do this. And for 8 years, outside of some weak sanctions, the West basically rolled their eyes at the situation and said, you know, it sucks, but what we gonna do? What are we gonna do? I remember Barack Obama said in 2015, a year after the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea and holding of 1/3 of both Donetsk and Luhansk, he said that, you know, if Russia was to invade all of Ukraine and conquer all of Ukraine, that would make it very difficult for us to progress in our relationship. Very strong language from the Obama administration. Anyway, that policy failed. Obama's policy, Trump's policy, failed on Ukraine, and Russia, emboldened, invaded in February 2022 and tried to conquer the capital. Failed. And now we have the war we're seeing right now with the Ukrainians pushing back, trying to retake their territory. I don't know how you see that situation and then blame it on the West. But he gave me an explanation. I was like, oh, thank God. He gave an explanation as to why this is the West's fault and it isn't Russia's fault. Okay, here is his post. Poroshenko, this is the person from before Zelensky. This is Petro Poroshenko was voted upon and elected into power after Yanukovych fled the country. And after he fled the country, they had elections and Poroshenko was elected. Poroshenko, Zelensky's predecessor, overtook the country in a CIA-led coup, then banned all other political parties. Ethnic Russians within the country were furious and wanted political representation. They were branded terrorists and murderers by the Ukrainian one-party state. Putin tried to mitigate this and end the killing for 7+ years. Eventually, he stepped in to save the ethnic Russians in the kill zone. I have no idea why nobody knows this. I live on the border, okay? And I live currently, at least in Ukraine. I don't know why either me living in Ukraine or you living on the border or any of this would mean that any of this argument would be more solid. Living on the border of a country does not mean you can talk about that country with any effect. I have lived on the border of Mexico all my life. I do not know cartel politics very well. I have lived on the border of Canada all my life. I live in the United States. If you would have asked me about the relationship between the Canadian political parties and their leaders, I would have no idea. We live very close to Cuba. If you were to ask me about the major Cuban political leaders and who they are, I couldn't say outside of what, like Raul Castro, and that's all I know. So I don't know why him living on the border. I'm gonna go through and go back and push back against all of this, and I do mean all of this in a second. But I just wanted to put out, like, I don't care if you live on the border. That doesn't mean anything. You know what? A lot of Russians live on the border with Ukraine, and a lot of Russians have a very skewed and incorrect view of the war. Many Ukrainians also know this and agree with the special military operation. I'm not Russian. I'm not Ukrainian. I am not biased. These are just the easily verifiable historical facts. I could type 20 plus paragraphs on NATO expansion and abuse of power by the Ukrainian government, corruption, etc. But I don't need to. Well, I think he doesn't need to because he can't. I don't think he knows anything about it. I think it's just he's heard this secondhand and is repeating what other people have told him. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. I've covered my views on podcasts and don't have time to cover the complex features to everybody tweeting at me who don't know the basics. I generally hoped that helped. Have a great day. Okay, so let's go through this from the start. Poroshenko overtook the country in a CIA-led coup, then banned all other political parties. So first off, it wasn't a CIA-led coup. American government officials like Victoria Nuland didn't want there to be a revolution. Didn't want there to be an overthrow of the government really all that much. If you listen to their testimony in the Victoria Nuland phone call that was leaked, in that testimony, they wanted them to accept the deal put forward by Poroshenko because maybe they didn't view the movement as having enough momentum. Maybe they didn't want there to be too much chaos. Maybe they didn't want to trigger some sort of like Russian reaction to, you know, their hardball. We could call it the hardball style of negotiation known as coercion, economic coercion, failing. For whatever reason, Victoria Nuland did not want them to go through with more protests, and they wanted them to accept the deal. That's what the phone call showed. And there is no evidence showing that the CIA led any coup. The protests on the street grew and exploded because Poroshenko, Yanukovych sent out thugs. And when I say thugs, I mean literal street criminals. He paid them money, sent them out to stab and murder protesters along with the Berkut, an extremely corrupt racketeering organization of special police, which then beat protesters with metal pipes, like taped nuts and bolts and nails to flashbangs and threw them into crowds and ended up murdering a lot of people. People saw that brutality and reacted to it with anger, exploding the protests in not only the Euromaidan but Automaidan as well. Then the government tried to respond by banning protest, trying to ban people's right to assembly, trying to make it so any grouping of more than 3 people would lead to those people being arrested and thrown in jail. Now, as somebody who likes to fight against the Matrix and fight for freedom of expression, you would expect maybe he would sympathize with that position, but no. Anyone who would reject their government banning their right to freedom of expression and the right to protest, anyone who would react to that would obviously be a CIA agent. Anyone who would be angry at their brothers and sisters and protesters, their colleagues on the ground, getting murdered by the Berkut, and Russian paid and Ukrainian government paid at the time, thugs on the street. Oh no, they're all CIA agents. Ask Tristan Tate where the money went to. The closest you'll ever get to any answer about where this CIA group or CIA operation was is the National Endowment for Democracy, which is managed by the United States Congress to give endowments to what we call pro-democracy movements. What does that mean? Organizations against corruption, organizations that support the, you know, things, not the First Amendment, because that's the First Amendment in the United States, but things like freedom of expression, which obviously, if Yanukovych's regime was trying to ban protest, they're not going to look upon those organizations very favorably. But the few $1 million that we gave to the Endowment for the Democracy, NED, if somebody's really going to tell me that a few NGOs advocating against corruption is all it took for the Ukrainian system to collapse, you're thinking the Ukrainian Yanukovych regime to collapse, you think very little of the Ukrainian protesters who went out there and fought and died during Euromaidan. And honestly, I don't know how any regime or any government stays stable if all it takes is $2 to $3 million to collapse the government. $2 to $3 million. I mean, if this is the case, then the election of Donald Trump was a Russian coup. And that is the spreading of disinformation within the United States through the Internet Research Agency. That's been confirmed. His election is a Russian coup? Of course not. That would be ridiculous. That would be dishonest to say that. And that's a lot more deliberate interference within American domestic politics than giving money to an NGO against corruption efforts. And a lot of this money they'll talk about billions of dollars. We did not give billions of dollars to organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy. We gave billions and billions of dollars to organizations tackling issues like human trafficking. So all of this is a lie. Also, then banned all other political parties. Yanukovych's political party was allowed to continue to operate after Yanukovych fled the country. So they banned all the opposition parties, but then allowed Yanukovych's political party to continue to operate after he fled. There were like 10 or 11 political parties that were operating at the time, and multiple political parties that operate to this day. Ukraine is not a one-party state. That is ridiculous. It isn't a one-party state. If it was a one-party state, why was it that Poroshenko lost the election of 2019 to Zelensky and was ousted on an anti-establishment a wave of people wanting to see the anti-corruption aspects of Euromaidan fulfilled? Again, this is just completely uninformed, and honestly, I think either just came from somebody telling him alt history nonsense, or is just a deliberate lie. And he doesn't know how to deal with the critiques he's getting, so he just has to lie. Ethnic Russians within the country were furious and wanted political representation. They were branded terrorists and murdered by the Ukrainian one-party state. So he doesn't give any details here, because nobody was murdered for being angry. Nobody was murdered or killed for wanting political representation. I have no clue what he's talking about here, outside of one thing I could imagine he was talking about. In the east of Ukraine, after Russia invaded and annexed Crimea, Russian operatives started operating in the Donbass trying to start a revolt. Igor Girkin and many others have openly admitted to this. Igor Girkin has admitted, as a former FSB agent and a former defense minister for the next People's Republic, the Russian proxy set up in Donetsk, he has admitted that he held Crimean politicians at gunpoint and forced them to dissolve the parliament. Those people were operating in the Donbass trying to cause problems. Vladimir Putin denied this until a few years later, when those people were caught by the Ukrainian government and put in front of the world, and they had to admit it on TV. So during that period, when this chaos was happening and Russia was invading, these separatists, backed up by these Russian proxies and given weapons by the Russian government, then started to seize government buildings. The government obviously not wanting these buildings to be taken by force, and for these people to say by force, like, hey, you know what? We're no longer a country. We're not going to have a vote. We're not going to have some type of transition, or we're just taking it because the Russians said we could. They sent the military down there, and then they started fighting. That is what I think he's referring to when he said murdered for wanting political representation. If that's the case, then someone could say that Lincoln went and murdered all the Southerners for wanting political representation. Now, is it true that Southerners died in the fighting that followed? Yes. Is it true that the Southerners wanted, the ones involved in the rebellion, wanted a certain type of political representation? Yeah, but you're leaving out a lot of crucial information to paint them as the victims. In the example of the Civil War, that would be the attack that was actually started by the South on Fort, it wasn't Fort Bragg. Does anybody remember what fort was attacked at the start of the war by the South that kicked it off? It was the first shots of the Civil War they talk about. I think it was Fort Sumter. It was Fort Sumter. In this case, this version of Fort Sumter, which was the Confederates attacking American government installations, shooting off the war, was these Russian-backed separatists seizing government buildings and grabbing weapons and ready to get combat, and ready to go into combat with the Ukrainian armed forces. So again, just horrible misrepresentation of what happened in that period. Again, not a one-party state. If the member of the party that fled the country after backstabbing its people and murdering its people, if his party continued to operate in that political environment, you can't call it a one-party state. Putin tried to mitigate this and end the killing for 7+ years. He sent weapons into the Donbass. He sent troops into Crimea. Those weapons were then used to shoot down civilian airliners like the Malaysian flight. And the fighting continued. I don't know what he did to mitigate and end the killings that was particularly special and is deserving of mention. Eventually, he stepped in to save the ethnic Russians in the kill zone. So what he's saying right here is a common Russian state media narrative. The idea that is Russia invaded Ukraine in order to save the Russian speakers of the Donbass. Now, if Russia had to start a war in order to save the civilians of the Donbass, after 7-8 years of this basically being a stalemate, what type of thing do you think would inspire him to do that? Well, I would assume like maybe a spike in civilian casualties in this frozen conflict, or maybe an extremely high amount of civilian casualties just generally that went on for too long. How many civilian casualties do you think died in 2021, just the year before, in this frozen conflict? I believe it was 7 to 15, if I remember correctly. It was 7 to 15. I think I'm leaning closer to 7, if I remember correctly. Somebody else is saying 26, right? Basically, highest margin, double digits. Is that great? No. And lower end of the double digits, mind you. Is that great? No. Those deaths are tragedy. Those are all tragedies. But number one, they were not all deaths of Ukraine just bombing people randomly and all of those people died. Some of them were killed by the separatists. That's the first thing. And the second thing is the percentage of Eastern Ukrainians, Eastern Russian-speaking Ukrainians that have been killed due to violence in this conflict, this Russian invasion, has skyrocketed. Skyrocketed. We're not talking about a 100 to 200% increase. We're talking about a 10,000% to 20,000% increase in civilian casualties. That's the numbers we're talking about right now. So it's very hard for me to imagine that with this gigantic increase of Russian-speaking Eastern Ukrainians being killed by Russian bombardments, by cluster munitions, by thermobaric weapons, by undetonated duds, from artillery shells and rockets, from mines, anti-personnel mines, whether it be the Mon 50 mines, butterfly mines, all these civilians dying is to save them. That the almost 2 years of escalated violence Ukraine hasn't seen on this scale since World War II, is to protect civilians. When I went to Eastern Ukraine, all the soldiers I talked to spoke to me in Russian. They were local territorial defense units. First time I ever went to the forward operating position. They were all speaking Russian. Just because someone speaks Russian doesn't mean they want to be part of Russia. If you went to Ireland and heard most of the people speaking English and not the native Irish tongue, and you said, oh, do you Irish want to be British? You're not going to get a positive reaction. What language am I speaking to you in? It's not American. That's not a language. It's English. Do I want to be part of England? I'd rather die. But somehow that's the standard we're applying to the Ukrainian people. Okay, whatever. Continuing. I have no idea why nobody knows this. Probably because it's a fucking lie. I live on the border. I don't care. Many Ukrainians also know this and agree with the special military operation. I did respond to Tristan Tate because I wanted a response to this specifically, and I linked him a study from the Kiev Independent. Well, there wasn't a study from the Kiev Independent, but it's Kiev Independent talking about I believe it was the Kiev Institute who did a poll that showed that 85% of Ukrainians don't want to concede any territory whatsoever to the Russians. And that's one poll. We can also look at Pew Research data. We can also look at many, many, many other polling institutes. There's not a single polling institute in the world that will say the majority of Ukrainians want to surrender, the majority of Ukrainians blame the West and not Russia, that the majority of Ukrainians want to concede to Russian demands, or that the majority of Ukrainians don't want more support from the West. That data does not exist, and he is not showing that data because it's not real. He is trying to use either a personal anecdote that he experienced to try to extrapolate a whole people's opinion while speaking for them on their behalf, when he could look at the data and see what they actually believe as a majority. This data is publicly available. Okay, I guess they don't have geopolitics classes or statistics classes in the war room that Tristan Tate can study in. But this data is publicly available. He doesn't cite it because it doesn't support his answer. I don't even think he knows really many Ukrainians that think this. I think he's just bullshitting me and everyone else that reads this post. I'm not Russian. I'm not Ukrainian. I am not biased. Whether or not Tristan Tate is personally biased, and I mean, I don't want to make too many assumptions, but we can all maybe imagine why Tristan Tate or Andrew Tate might be biased towards the nation state that has made it easier to beat your wife. I don't know, but I can't make assumptions about people's motives, right? I can't know if he's personally biased. But through reading his sources, I do think either A, he's being purposely contrarian and lying in order to garner media attention because it's popular to take the anti-establishment position on Ukraine. And in a way, he's being a sheep in response to the establishment, because if you just do the opposite of what the establishment does every time, that just makes you a sheep in reverse. That's the one option. Or the other option is that he got all of his sources from people who were biased. And maybe he himself isn't biased, but he was told his narratives around the war, either from Douglas McGregor, maybe Scott Ritter, maybe who knows who it was. But he got this from people who maybe he thought at the time were reputable, but were just Russian propagandists, because these are all Russian propaganda talking points that are not substantiated by facts. But he says that these are easily verifiable historical facts. They're not. You Google any of this stuff, you're not going to come up with evidence. That's why he didn't cite evidence, and he didn't respond to any of the evidence that was cited against him, or respond to the context that was added by the Twitter context feature on multiple of his posts talking about this, which corrected him. I could type 20 plus paragraphs on NATO expansion. I don't know if he can type 20 plus paragraphs, period, on NATO expansion and abuse of power by the Ukrainian government, corruption, etc. But I don't need to. I've covered my views on podcasts and don't have time to cover the complex issues to everybody tweeted at me who don't know the basics. I genuinely hope that helped. Have a great day. You know, maybe they're just angry that Ukraine is slowly but surely moving away from its history of corruption. Not fast enough, but it is. And so after facing, you know, the Romanian legal justice system, they want to make sure that there's a semi-corrupt system that they can flee to in the future where they can just pay off the prosecutors there. And you think I'm exaggerating. I am being a little hyperbolic. I'm being a little facetious here, but I mean, Andrew Tate did openly talk about wanting to move to Romania because the system's corrupt and he can just pay everybody off if he commits a crime. Kind of came back to bite him, didn't it? Anyway, the Tate brothers, they don't know anything about geopolitics. The war room certainly doesn't know much about the actual war that's happening.